It's a real privilege to be here on the inaugural Stanley Feingold Lecture. I was hired in 1991 into the department that Stanley taught in. I'm a political scientist by training and spent most of my career in the department here. In 1991, Stanley was no longer part of the political science department, but he was at that time and would continue for probably about 15 or 16 years to publish with George McKenna, who was in the department, his Taking Sides volumes. And if you ever stopped by the political, they had a day in the spring where they would do most of the architectural work to put those books together. And Stanley and George, over the course of the previous year, would have gathered together newspaper clippings of opposing issues. George was conservative. Stanley, you may say, was not. And so, pity the person who walked by the conference room on that day, because from the moment they sat down until when they left, they were looking for a jury. And you didn't want to be part of that jury. They come in here, sit down a second. Now, tell me, in my first year, tell me, young man, what do you think about this debate? And then you'd be off to the races, and I would get a little taste of what you all had when you came to City College. I think most of you in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so it's entirely appropriate that we have some of you longer ago, is that what I'm hearing? Okay. It's entirely appropriate that we have constructed today's presentation as Stanley might have said debate, we will say conversation and see how it goes. But I didn't want to kick off this inaugural conversation without also saying something about all of you. Because from the moment I came into the political science department, I was told by people who had been around, you've got to meet the Bull and Vittles Club. Which is how you were, I don't know if that's what you called yourself, but it's certainly what we called you when we thought about you. But the extent to which you have maintained your connection with one another, maintained your sense of this college as a formative place, and your affection, respect, loyalty to the man who, I gather day in and day out, sat you down and asked you what you thought about the most important issues of the day, is truly extraordinary. It is a model, I think, of what we look for in our alumni, a sense that if this college shaped you, and I know it did, and if people at this college helped form the opinions that you've carried with you through life, that you should continue that relationship. And I know you've done it in big ways and small for decades, but this is really different. This inaugural Stanley Feingold Lecture Series is the moment when you have decided as a group that this should be part of City College, our annual calendar going forward. And so I am humbled by your commitment. I'm honored to be the one here to kick the day off. I am so grateful for the work that I know all of you have been doing for quite some time to work with us to pull this event off. So with that, I'm pleased to inaugurate the annual Stanley Feingold Lecture Series and to call one of your number, Anita Altman, to the podium to give some opening remarks. Anita?
Hi, and good afternoon and welcome. This lecture series was founded by a large group of alumni in partnership with the Colin Powell School of City College to honor the memory of a beloved, gifted professor of political science, Stanley Feingold. Stanley was a proud graduate of CCNY and taught here for almost 4 decades. He was a passionate teacher, devoted to intellectually challenging his students while giving each of us the respect we all deserve. Stanley operated, however, from the basic pedagogical premise that the student was always wrong. That is, whether you are a liberal, a conservative, or a radical, he, challenged all of us. And it helped us learn that we should take nothing for granted and that it was necessary for us to analyze carefully all the facts and opinions that we were exposed to. In these times in particular, we need this lesson more than ever. Stanley didn't teach. He rather helped each of us to develop his or her own ability to learn. His contribution to the art and science of teaching has been heralded by the most important judges of such work, his students, his colleagues, and the administrators of the schools in which he served. Thousands of students have benefited from his work, and as so many of us can testify, he made us intellectually hungry and challenged our assumptions, taught us analytic rigor and careful reasoning. He was to his students more than a teacher. He's been a mentor. He inspired us to live a life with integrity and intellectual honesty, and for so many of us, to pursue lives of public service. After he left the college, students of Stanley had the opportunity and good fortune to build a close personal relationship with him, meeting him for lunches. There are some who met on a regular basis for over 35 years. For almost 2 decades, Stanley flew in from the West Coast, where he had retired, to attend these lunches. And frankly, it was only then, at these lunchtime discussions, that we learned what his real political opinions were. Passionately felt, but for all those years in the classroom, he carefully restrained from sharing them with us. Moreover, he continued to write, and we were blessed to receive on a fairly regular basis his many opinion pieces. Over time, they compiled into a significant body of essays which revealed his humanity and his progressive perspective that challenged so many conventional wisdoms. A link was actually provided in the invitation, and it will be sent to each of you again, of his writings, in the hope that you'll read some of this work and share them and discuss them. They're very meaty and they're very powerful. Finally, on behalf of my fellow alums, I want to express our profound appreciation for the enthusiastic support of President Boudreaux, Didi Mozaleski, and Kevin Foster, who've made it possible for us to honor our beloved teacher with the founding of this annual Stanley Feingold Lecture Series. My only regret is that Stanley is not here to receive this honor at this institution he so dearly loved. But I'm so glad that Fumiko and his daughter Karen are here to join in the celebration of this remarkable man, who so many of us had the great fortune to call our teacher and our friend. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sid Davidoff, and I'm a proud alumnus of this school. And my only job today is to, at this point, is to introduce our moderator, who was an old friend, and he told me to keep it very short. So I'm going to keep it very short because he has a long career. Mostly right now, since 1987, he's been with the New York Times, the Urban Affairs correspondent, which covers all of the metropolitan area in New York, and now has moved on to the obituaries, which is a very important thing for us because I go back with Sam. He covered us when I was in City Hall, starting in 1966. I think he went to work for the news around 67. Covered Liz, who was also an assistant to Mayor Lindsay at the time, as I was. Covered us at City Hall, and for these 50 years has become the Lindsay alumni important person, and since he's writing the obits, he writes all our obits, so he can't die before any of us. It's my pleasure to introduce a very fair, very good, columnist, news person, Sam Roberts.
Sid, thank you for keeping it short. And I'll remind you, in case you don't know, Sid told me, and I'm going to have to save this for his advance obituary, which is well in advance, but he and Ron Dellums are the only surviving members of Nixon's original enemies list. So thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Sid. Thank you, Paul Bergman. Thank you, Anita. And thank you, members of the family. And I'm very pleased to be here for this first lecture. I have always had a great affection for City College. My father graduated from here, and he told me many times about putting his ROTC uniform on the subway on his way here from Brooklyn. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists because I'm sure you already know them. Liz Holtzman was, of course, a congresswoman from Brooklyn. She defeated Manny Seller, who was the dean of the House at the time. He was the head of the Judiciary Committee. She sat in on the Watergate hearings, a very prominent member of that panel. And of course, she became the first woman district attorney in New York City, and then the city controller. And Ed Cox is the chairman of the Republican State Committee. He was John McCain's campaign chairman in New York in 2008, and was a trustee of the State University of New York. And I'd like to begin, this is going to be a conversation, not a debate, although I'd like the panelists to be able to ask questions of each other if they want. And we're going to be talking about the midterm elections and their impact. First, I think in terms of Washington, then in terms of Albany, and then I'd like to open the floor to questions from you as well. And again, this is a conversation. We're going to cover a lot of topics, including Liz's new book, which is the case for impeachment of Donald Trump, for or against. Alan Dershowitz has a new book out, which is counter to Liz's, the case against impeachment, and they are going to be debating on the road. I'm sure you'll be enjoying hearing that too. But I was a major in political science in college, and what's going on today seems to defy what I learned in school, which is not all that surprising to anyone who has gone to school. But, you know, Liz comes from the Democratic Party, and could we really call what we are living in a democracy when, you know, we vote for a president like Hillary Clinton, and the majority of Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, and she's not the president? And we live in a republic, supposedly, and the representatives in a republic are supposed to represent the people, but we have a Senate that is totally disproportionate to the people that are represented. And of course, when you look at the demographics of the country, that is going to get worse and worse as more and more people move to urban areas. And then if you question the definition of Democratic and Republican, then let's look at the question of party. 37% of registered voters in this country describe themselves as independents, neither as Democrats or Republicans. So if Democrat and Republican are misnomers, and party is a misnomer, then what is the Democratic Party and what is the Republican Party? What do they stand for anymore? Who wants to leap into that morass?
Let me just open by, as a matter of introduction in part, what you said about Professor Feingold struck a chord with me. I was not in the political science department at Princeton, but I was at the Woodrow Wilson School, which gave me a license to take any courses I wanted to. And I gravitated towards a professor, some of you may recall way back when, called Alpheus T. Mason. And he was a great constitutional scholar at Princeton and was, in essence, he was a McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence there, and the grandson, from a professor point of view, of Woodrow Wilson. He was the first, and he taught his precepts like Wilson taught his. And like you said, the Professor Feingold was, the student was always wrong. And it was the same thing with Professor Mason. It put a discipline on the student. And I ended up taking this graduate course with all these eager graduate students. And his approach was to say, well, Mr. Cox, you said this. Mr. Jones, what do you think about that? And you'd have to do a 10-page paper every week in order to get for it. And then pretty soon you'd have everyone fighting, and he'd sit back and watch the fight and enjoy it. And in the end, you'd really struggle with the topic. And I remember struggling with the topic of, he gave me the topic to write my 10-page paper on Chief Justice Marshall and President Jackson, and see how they compare. And I struggle. I wrote a paper. I said, look, Professor, I got to give you 2 papers. I can't quite put them together. And he said, well, Mr. Cox, isn't the fact that they're both nationalists, bingo, and the 2 came together. I just missed that big point. And that kind of, that intellectual process of writing is something that, as you said, it's the process, not necessarily the content, that if you struggle with the topic, you can come up to some truth comes out of it that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten. That's what good professors do. So, while I didn't know Professor Feingold, I understand, I think, the attachment of people here to him.
Okay, now that you ducked the question, though. I mean, the Des Moines Register had an editorial in October, hardly a radical newspaper, said that the party is your party, becoming the party of Trump. The Republicans have forsaken traditional conservatism, given voters no rational alternative to the Democrats. The party needs to be voted out of power and spend a few years becoming again the party of Lincoln, not the party of Trump. So what is the party?
Well, I'm not sure you can take Lincoln down the present day. I think you can. I think a very decisive, and I have to say, I come from the political philosopher school rather than political scientist. You're talking more science than philosopher. But the parties used to be a combination of different sections of the country. You put it together, and it was what the individuals stood for, really, in their individual sections. I call 1994 election as being the last battle of the Civil War, because that's when the Republican Party, after winning presidential elections by carrying the South, first the border states and the Deep South, we, in fact, in 94, swept the congressional seats, and all those yellow dog Democrats became Republicans. And then we became the Conservative Party, and the Democratic Party lost its conservative base, and over time both gravitated to separate corners. And so we lacked the diversity in each of the parties. I don't know how that brings us up to the present day, but I think that's why you have the 2 parties that really are on opposite, that find few areas of compromise. And it's just a structural matter going forward.
And Liz, what do you think? The Democratic Party in this past election seemed to be the party of not Trump. How does it win back the people that Hillary Clinton, for one, described as deplorables, but it needs to win any election? And people who have legitimate grievances, even if they feel like they are, people who have been dissed by white elites or ethnic elites. That's easy.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with your first question.
Okay.
And let me make a confession here. I didn't study political science in college. I studied history and literature.
History is a good start.
Yeah, try Thucydides, and reading poetry is a good preparation for being in Congress and reading legislation and so forth and so on.
The Thucydides trap is now current.
Yeah, well, how about that? You live long enough, everything comes back. But anyway, I think you raise a really profound question that goes beyond the parties, which is, about our democracy. First of all, we have a lot of, ideals about America, as we should. My parents, my mom's family, they were refugees from Russia, and they fled both communism and the pogroms, and so America was a sanctuary, a safety, a place of safety. Now, things have changed. I think we have to be very realistic about our country. It was born out of slavery. Slaves, were the engine, economic engine, not just of the South, but of a lot of what happened in the North. We're uncovering that now in various universities. Yale, Princeton, Harvard. So what does that say about where we are? I was in the South in the Civil Rights Movement, so I know we made huge progress. I think that's one of the great defining things about our country, is that the idealism infects the people who've been left out, and they want to make it better, and they can. And I saw that happen. That's why I got into government, because people put their young people, particularly, were the ones who sang and marched and peacefully protested and changed Jim Crow. But if we look at the structure of things now, we have some problems. And I don't have a solution, but I think it's really important to start to talk about them and think about them, and they go way beyond parties, which is if we have an emptying out of rural America, urbanization, even greater urbanization of America, is the structure that was created by the Constitution of having 2 senators from every state, is that really, as things get more and more out of balance, does that really work? And how do we rethink that? Maybe that's too big a question, because constitutional and structural changes don't happen easily in America, and they shouldn't. Framers spent a lot of time trying to figure it out, and more or less, aside from the issue of slavery and excluding women, and a few other things, they got a lot right. So you need to be careful about tampering with it. But I think those are really, really important questions. I think what's happening now, it's not the first time. When I started out in politics in Brooklyn, we had a Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party wasn't very interested in seeing people cast a free ballot. A lot of people weren't eligible to vote, and the rules on voting were very tough, and you had local party officials walking people into the voting booths so that they could make sure that they understood what they were doing. Oh yeah, that's the good old days. In Brooklyn, this was not today with the repression that we're seeing of the vote. But here with all the idealism, tempered of course with the reality, we have a major effort to cut back on people's right to vote. We need to change. That's easier to change. And that's an area where New York State, and I actually think that's an area where Republicans and Democrats can come together and say, how do we have a system that encourages people to vote? One thing you left out of your litany of problems with democracy is that too many people don't vote at all. And we don't make it easy for them to vote. So those are, I think they're very serious questions. I don't think they're easy answers to them. The country is changing in a profound way. And how do we reach people who are less well educated, who live in rural areas? They see the world changing around them in a way that is very threatening, maybe not now, but where their children aren't going to live in Kansas. So what happens to them? They're going to move to LA or Northern Virginia or Long Island City. So, the world is changing. How do we deal with that? And it's a responsibility of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So I think they're big challenges. Some of them are easier. The voting issue should be easy, and both parties should get together on that. Both parties have been culprits. Democrats were in the past, I know that, but the Republicans are now. We just should say, let's just cut that out and make it really easy and fraud-proof to vote.
Ed, what do you think? Should there be structural or even constitutional changes along those lines? Do they talk about enlarging the House of Representatives for one? The Senate might be a little bit tougher.
Let me just, because you gave a little bit of background, Liz. You were involved in the civil rights movement. I got involved through Ralph Nader when he taught a seminar at Princeton. I did my senior thesis for him, asked me to come down and work for him. And we put a small group of us did the first summer with him and created this thing called Nader's Raiders.
Oh, you were
It was-
Nader Raider?
I started it.
Wow.
The three of us, Felmuth and myself and John Schultz, wrote the book. And then there were 200 that came down the next summer, including Mark Green, Jim Fallows, and a number of other people have gone on, right or left. But my point is, it's like civil rights, it was a nonpartisan thing that you got involved in, not as a partisan matter, that I got involved in as a nonpartisan matter. And that's what got us involved in politics, and that was my first instruction in it. And I think, just as a comment on Ralph, when he got involved in politics itself, I think that's when he sort of self-destructed. Otherwise, he would have been the great man of the consumer movement. And his turning point, I basically worked for him 2 years. We got very close. And he basically got into a very partisan mode, and that didn't work, which is a lesson in politics. I don't know about the constitutional question that you asked, Sam. I don't know. I can comment on that. But to carry on with what happened with Trump, which I was very much involved in the process by which he was elected, and got to see him very close up, because as some of you may remember, he ran for governor of New York State at the start. No? No one remembers? Oh yeah, he did. He made a couple forays upstate, and that's where he developed his style of speaking to groups up in...
Are you taking credit for this now, or?
I can take credit for some of it, actually, because I told him it wasn't going to work. Because he was basically, he was saying, I don't want a primary, I don't want a primary. He's saying it publicly. And it suddenly dawned on me that he thought our system, and that's two different kinds of systems. There's a national system where you have a primary that decides who's going to be the nominee at the convention. Sometimes you get to a contest at the convention, but it used to be great contests, no longer really. They're rare. In New York State, we have, first of all, the designating convention, and then we have a primary for those who want to petition onto the ballot, and for those who get on the ballot without a primary, if they get more than 25% at the convention, et cetera. It's a totally different. And he was saying, I don't want a primary, and it didn't make sense to me. And suddenly, he's thinking nationally. And I'm chairman of the party, I better straighten this out with him. And finally, we get together in Mar-a-Lago. He's down in Florida campaigning to be governor of New York State. It's clear. He wants to be president. And he's getting advice. I actually got a call from Roger Stone saying, no, Donald ought to run directly for the presidency. That was, look, well, regardless of what you think of him, he had some good ideas that were sort of off the wall, but in the end, he was right. And so with all that together, we have the conversation, and I basically say, Donald, you should not run for governor. It's not going to work the way you want to do it. He didn't like that. He stomped off, and next morning, I was called a loser on Morning Joe. About a year and a half later, he's the head of the pack, and he makes a beeline for me. Ed, you saved me, thank you. Because he realized he wouldn't have won. He couldn't have. You can't run for two offices at once, basically. It doesn't work. And that's what he figured as a businessman. Roger's crazy. Whoever won the presidency directly, a businessman, he had to run for something else in his mind. He ended up, because it didn't work, running directly for
What
it.
impact do you think he's had on the party?
And I'm glad you asked that, because I'm not sure it was a strategy, but it's what he did instinctively, maybe. Maybe it was a strategy. But he did it backwards. He, first of all, if you're Mr. Nixon, you're Mr. Reagan, or you're W. Bush, and they were all successful, and they could appeal to the ethnic Democrats, as they were called by Nixon, or the Reagan Democrats, and these are Democrats who are prone to vote Republican if, in fact, the president can appeal to them culturally and by style and by policies. And they are somewhat akin to the Santorum and Buchanan Republicans. Trump, first of all, went for those groups, and he captured them. He is 1/3 of the party being the Buchanan and Santorum Republicans. That kept him in the 30% and ahead of a pack of 17 Republicans. And then he kept going up, getting more and more. But he also had those Democrats right from the start. The regular Republicans, the others, he got those at the very end of the campaign, and they came in with huge questions, but voted for him. In part, and I was there when it happened, when he got together with Reince Priebus, because they each needed each other for reasons I could go into. But Reince said to him, after he made clear to him that Reince was going to be his chairman, Reince said, I want a list, Donald, of 15 Supreme Court nominees from you. Knowing that that is something that the regular Republicans was important to bringing them into. He hadn't connected with those, that 2/3 of the party, and he finally did. And part of it led to what his Supreme Court nominees, obviously.
Let me ask you a totally unfair question. Did you vote for him?
Yes.
Okay. Liz, I had dinner with someone last night and asked something that Ed just raised about nonpartisanship or bipartisanship. And he said the three things that went wrong were jet travel, television, and money. That people don't stay in Washington anymore. They spend all their time raising money, and TV makes them appeal to wider audiences. Why don't people talk to each other anymore in Washington? Whatever happened to compromise and guys and now women sitting down over a couple of drinks and hashing something out?
Well, actually, women have done somewhat of a better job of this. As you know, in the House of Representatives, there's a caucus on women's issues. It started out as a Congresswomen's caucus, but there are men now who belong to it. And they found a common ground on bipartisan as a Republican woman is chair and a Democratic woman is chair, and they focus on issues affecting the status of women in America, and they've made a difference. They made a difference over a long period of time. It's a bipartisan group, and it works that way in the Senate. Women came together when there was a big debate over the Senate and was going to vote for the budget, and they managed to work out a compromise. So there are still ways to do that, and there are ways of collegiality, but the politics has gotten very bitter, and I have to say that I don't think that Trump's insults, politics of humiliation and personal attack, really facilitates the kind of focus on issues where focus on the common ground. I talked about changing voting laws. I think that's something that there ought to be a common ground on. Anyway, that hasn't happened. With regard to finance, part of the problem was the Supreme Court's, I would say, totally illogical decision where they said that it's called Buckley versus Valeo. Everyone's focused on Citizens United. But the real culprit is a case called Buckley versus Valeo, in which the Supreme Court, thanks to Whizzer White, wrote an opinion saying that, or supported an opinion saying that money is speech. Well, that's where my history and literature background came in, because money is not speech, as a matter of fact. There's no equal sign. It's a metaphor. It's a quote, if you want some kind of very bad poetry, but that's what it is. And we've been put into a straitjacket by that opinion. Money is not speech. It facilitates speech. It can drown out speech. It can have a positive effect on bringing speech to many people, and it can also stop speech from reaching people. So it's that metaphor, that poetry, if you will, has really clouded the minds of the Supreme Court, and as a consequence, we're trapped. I think that raising I think the consequences that you point out are correct. Members of Congress spend way too much time raising money for elections. Being in Congress is a hard job. It's a very hard and important job. I mean, you have to vote on a whole lot of issues, whether it's the agriculture bill or what's happening with regard to sanctions in Iran. What about tariffs? What about the budget? I mean, this requires a lot of, it's not slogans. I mean, yes, of course, if you don't want to do your job, it's really easy. But if you want to do your job in a serious way, there's a lot to learn. And if you spend all your time on the phone, that's going to be a difficulty. There's now a caucus of former members of Congress, and a few governors have kind of butted their way into this. This is a very bipartisan group, like the Congresswomen's caucus. It's headed by a Democrat and a Republican. And one of the issues they focused on is, reducing, cutting back on the time that members of Congress have to spend fundraising. And I think the time that you spend on the phone also gives you a very, biased isn't the right word. It gives you a very blindered view of what's going on in the world, because you're only talking to people who've got a substantial amount of money, and you need to be going out and talking to everyone in the district you want to represent, including the deplorable, so you find out what's on their mind. I mean, that's one of the things that made me a much better Congresswoman than I would have been, which is to talk to people and find out what was what their concerns were. One of the most important bills I ever introduced into Congress came about because someone called my district office, because I was very accessible, with a complaint that led to the Orphan Drug Act, from a clogged sewer to the Orphan Drug Act, which has created now, hundreds of cures for rare diseases. So if you're not going to be reaching out to the problems that people have, how can you do your job in the right way? So yes, we have to do something about money, but I'm not sure how much we can do given this ridiculous, illogical, absurd Supreme Court decision, which has to be changed.
Well, Sam, let me approach it from the question you asked me, who I voted for, and get into it. But the Clintons actually are very good friends. They were very gracious to us when we went down to Washington when they were president and Gore's vice president. My father-in-law knew Gore's father, and all those relationships, the relationships of what first families do, getting together at funerals and opening of museums and things like that. Frankly, as a matter of policy, it was President Clinton who said the era of big government's over, passed NAFTA, did welfare reform, which had a huge impact in cutting the welfare rolls here in New York State as implemented by Pataki and Giuliani. There's real bipartisanship that happened back then. But so the issues that I had with Mrs. Clinton were not ones of personal ones, but on policy, she had to actually condemn NAFTA. She had to shift away from that. But more when you focus on what the economy needed, it was Larry Kudlow, my good friend, who I worked together in the Reagan administration in producing some good results. One was getting rid of a Rockefeller program that I happened to be general counsel of for 2 years that had $80 billion that would have been wasted, and depending upon where commodities went, and Kudlow was good on that working with Stockman. I watched him with Donald Trump say, look, what we need is tax cuts. They worked in the Reagan administration. We need deregulation, and over time, those were filled out Trump's basic instincts about policy. And they have really, and that's the reason why I've not just been a Republican, which is my natural tendency to vote for him and chairman of the party, but I thought that his economic policies were what the country needed. And in fact, they have worked out pretty well to date. And they were very well formulated. Reagan's ideas that produced the Reagan economic successes that went over a long period of time has changed to take care of the $3 trillion. I don't understand why Obama didn't repatriate that and make the small change in the tax system so that that money abroad could come back and go to a territorial system of taxation, which we've gone to now. And rates back then were 35% internationally, but other countries that cut it down to 20%, we had to cut it down to that to be competitive. These were simple things that had just never been adopted by Obama or on the table. Mrs. Clinton couldn't do that. Trump could do it.
I'll tell you, before you scoff at the tax program and whether it worked or not, this person who I had dinner with last night, who's a ranking Democrat in the party, said he was in 40 states during the midterm campaigns, talked to a lot of people who said they're making $79, $83 more a month because of the tax cuts. And now they can afford to fix their tractor or do things like that, which to them are really important. So, you know, again, these are the people who on the West Coast and the East Coast bubbles are being written off as deplorables, but for whom tax cuts to some extent are making a big difference. So we got to be careful of the perspective we have about things like this and take those kind of contexts into account.
Go ahead.
Liz,
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please do.
First of all, let
You
me
don't
just
have a
say,
tractor.
no, but I got a lot of other things. And frankly, I don't need a subsidy. And a lot of people who are in the top and the 1% don't need the subsidy.
No,
And that's
they're
the
getting
problem.
a lot more.
No,
Yes.
no, yes, that's the problem, which is the people who need the tax cut, let's assume that that's the case, are, you know, middle income, lower middle income people, that's one thing. But when you're giving the bulk of the tax cut to the richest of the rich who don't need it, what does that say about our country, about the whole idea of equality and fairness? It's a terrible policy. None of the tax cuts also came at a time, just the fairness of it is wrong, but it came also at a time that the economy was doing better, and the consequence was to gin it up, oh, guess what, just in time for the election, so that the economy could seem to be doing better, but we also have a huge deficit now, and this is really, let's go back, forgetting this one person who needed his tractor fixed, because this is Stockman's blueprint. I don't know how many of you remember David Stockman. I'm sure you remember him, Ed Cox. But David Stockman had a blueprint which he's now disavowed. And David Stockman was the budget director for Ronald Reagan.
He disavowed it then and was taken to the woodshed, as you will recall.
Yeah, but he still disavows it today, but it became the blueprint for this tax cut. And that is, you cut taxes, you raise the military budget, you create huge deficits, and then you go to the Democrats and the American people who say, we can't afford these deficits, they're ruining the country, so we've got to make cuts in spending. Guess where the cuts come? Medicare, Medicaid, ultimately Social Security. And guess what? Hasn't McConnell said we need to think about that? Hasn't Ryan said that? So we know what this plan is. And so the idea, part of the problem here, and I think it goes back to the issue you raised earlier about democracy. Democracy depends on people's being informed and understanding. Some of these issues are really complicated, and I know because I was controller of New York City, when you start talking about numbers, people's eyes glaze over. So people don't really understand. They've got the $79 in their pocket and they're happy, but if their Medicare is going to be cut in a year, how happy are they going to be? And that's the consequence here. So I think that so I really disagree with, oh, well, we've got to put $79 in the hands of a deplorable so that deplorables will vote for Hillary Clinton. Meanwhile, we're setting up a situation where their Medicare will be cut, and we're putting $79 million in the hands of a particular rich person. That is what we've set up, and that's unfair, and it's going to wreck our economy over the long run.
Let me bring it to ground in what happened here in New York State specifically, and the reason why we no longer have a majority in the state Senate. those
If
very...
I'm right, this is the first time since the 1930s that there's no Republican governor and both houses of the legislature are Democratic.
No.
Okay.
Because 10 years ago...
Well, yeah, except for that aberration.
That aberration.
Yeah.
And as I was talking to a prominent New York Times reporter who's coming here, and I said, the Democrats blew it then, and they're going to blow it again.
They
And he gave
certainly
a big,
squandered the
he gave a
opportunity.
big guffaw. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we're ready to make the counter arguments when that happens again. And for different reasons, but it will blow up again, which we could go into sometime. But the blue wave really hit in only one place in New York, and that's New York City, but we didn't care that much because there aren't any Republicans elected in New York City. So,
Not now.
well, I'm sorry, there was one, but that was more Staten Island. Staten Island is not.
Brooklyn.
Well,
Marty
par-
Goldman.
Marty Gold.
Yeah, right. What's that? No, right. No, I'm talking about New York City to begin with, and then you had the suburbs, and there were a number of Republicans who either stayed at home, very wealthy Republicans who stayed at home because of the Trump tax program, because they were offended by the fact that they no longer could deduct their very significant property taxes and the SALT deductions, if you will, were now capped at $10,000. And for that reason, they voted in those suburbs, those wealthy suburbs, the wealthy voted or stayed at home who were Republicans, and who, when the redistricting was done in 2011, there's only so many places you can find Republicans here in New York State when you're drawing the districts. And they had to go into those areas, and they picked up wealthy Republicans. Well, this time they turned, it wasn't just the blue wave that was involved in the results of the 2016 election that energized the Democrats, but also wealthy Democrats as well as Republicans. Democrats might have been tended to vote Republican. They actually voted the other way this time, and that's one reason why we lost those Senate seats, particularly in Nassau, this time around.
What's going to happen after 2020 if the Democrats keep control? After the census?
Then you got redistricting. And there, I haven't looked at it yet, but I did put the reporter onto this, and they'll be looking at, we'll be looking at. I'm sure everyone's aware that there is a commission that is going to do redistricting. No, not many people are aware of that, but that was established. As you would expect, it's controlled by the governor. Everyone sort of discounted it as something that wasn't much, but yet that's the law, and that's got to be dealt with. And I'm sure, I haven't looked at it in depth yet, but I'm sure there are criteria by which the commission would make their decisions, compact districts, et cetera. If you apply that to our congressional districts, they were drawn by judges because of the circumstances after in 2011. Cuomo didn't want to touch it, neither House, neither Republican nor Democrat. It's getting late, the judges drew it, and they drew nice districts. And we ended up with 9 of the 27, 1/3, that's about fits the Republican population here in the state. And those districts probably would stand if you apply good redistricting criteria to them. Clearly, the Assembly and the Senate would get we'd get more seats in the Assembly, less in the Senate, and hopefully we would have more than one third in in each house.
But how does a Republican Party survive in New York? Both senators have been Democratic since 1998. The last Republican governor was elected in 2002. The last Attorney General in 1994. The last Comptroller in 1990. Don't you feel a little lonely?
Actually, I've got a lot of company outside of New York City, although there are a lot of people on the west side of New York. Must have been hundreds of people coming, I'm the only Republican. But actually, there are a lot more Republicans around than people think in the end. But you go upstate, outside of the suburbs that are becoming increasingly. Nassau, which used to be one of the 4 big Republican counties 50 years ago, and even maybe 20 years ago. It was Orange County in California, which has now turned Democratic. Right. Nassau turned Democratic. There's one outside of Chicago that is tending that way. And Suffolk is the other one, and Suffolk is tending Democratic. So that's the population of cities moving out. As immigrants are moving in, population's moving out. And making those, how do we maintain, well, when you go upstate, beyond the lower Hudson Valley, maybe mid-Hudson Valley, then it becomes very red. And most of my county chairs are pretty happy with the results because Republicans were energized. And then in Chemung County, they may have lost Elmira, where they had it's a little blue dot in a Republican seat in Chemung County. They had a Republican county legislator, but because the Democrats just didn't vote, while the Republicans did in Elmira, this time we lost that, but the rest we swept in the rest of the county. So what took place nationally, what took place statewide, was taking place even within counties.
Liz, do the Democrats take the high road or the low road now as they look to 2020?
Well, I don't know what the low road is. If you mean by that attacking Trump, I think that's not necessarily the low road. Maybe the truth. The truth squad. But anyway, I think for me, looking at the election, I mean, the election was in part a referendum, or maybe to a large extent, a referendum on the president. And I think the thing that's troubling to me, and I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. My parents were refugees. I actually helped write the 1980 Refugee Act with Ted Kennedy. When that was adopted, it was not controversial, not at all. This country took, post-World War II, I mean, just in the time I'm aware of, and of course there were many refugees who came in the late 40s and after World War II, I'm not talking about that. But we took over 600,000 people from Cuba. We took over close to 1 million people from Vietnam. We took over 500,000 people leaving the Soviet Union. We took refugees from Iran. And now we have a president who freaks out, frothing at the mouth, over 2,000 children, maybe a quote-unquote caravan of 3,000 people coming from Mexico? Really? And whipping up fear about this? America was built. Nobody, actually, they discovered now in the roots that were taken by people coming to the Americas from Asia. But nobody is a native. Human race did not develop in North America or South America. We are all immigrants, all of us. And it's a shame, frankly, and a sad fact to think that this country would provide no sanctuary to refugees and to immigrants. We still have the Statue of Liberty in New York. It's a great sight. People from all over America come to look at it. Why? Because they still believe it resonates in terms of an ideal and a message. But we now have a president who not only wants to separates children from parents against the law without any legal authority, a cruel, heartless, lawless policy, but wants to stop people who seek asylum from coming into this country except at certain designated places, and wants to cut off the number of refugees coming into this country, and has reduced the number, and has increased the deportations of people who've been here, families who've been here for 20 years, 30 years, law-abiding citizens with American citizen children, American citizen spouses. Who's being hurt? American citizens by their deportation. This is not only a policy of demonization of the other. And the thing that has made America great, and I've lived in New York City almost all my life, except when I lived in Cambridge and Washington. But the thing that made those cities great, too, was that we welcomed the other. We were not afraid of the other.
Did we always do that?
No, there have been bad times in our history.
Such as?
The Know Nothing Party, such as Jim Crow and all the rest. But we've also had, up to this administration.
How about FDR?
What do you mean, how about FDR?
A boatload of Jewish
Yes,
refugees.
of course. That was
Came,
shameful too.
people fleeing Hitler, and was turned down by FDR, and they had to go back, many to their death in Europe because of him.
Immigration bill that reduced the number of Jewish refugees coming into the United States, and a member of Congress who voted against it was Liz's predecessor in Congress, who then, later on, after the Second World War, passed an immigration bill broadening entry into the United States.
Look, the point is there have been shameful moments. There have been shameful moments in our history, but the arc has to move in the right direction. And we've now had, for the first time, at least in my memory, FDR was before that. But in my memory, we are going backwards to a time of bigotry. And I've hastened to think that maybe the Republican Party can build itself on this kind of foundation, but it's a sad thing for the party, and it's a very sad thing for America.
There's no doubt we need to have a reform of our immigration laws. We do have laws, and you do need those, and you need to enforce them. At the moment, they're not good laws. But there was, in fact, supported by W, and so when he was weak in late in the second term, that there was a good bipartisan group that put together really good immigration reform. John McCain ran into a Democratic senator and said to him, "Come and join us." That's the way McCain is. And he kind of nodded his head and walked away and ended up putting a poison pill into it that destroyed it. The name of that senator was Barack Obama. So look, we need to have immigration reform. We got to get it right. The present laws really don't work.
But the refugee law works, and it's worked since 1980, and he's trashing it. Don't give me the immigration stuff. That's a separate issue. The refugee laws work. The asylum law, that needs to be, we don't have enough judges to handle it. But the principles of asylum and the principles of dealing with refugees are clear.
As I
and we
understand
have
the
law.
asylum law, and I'm not an expert on it, but the country that the person seeking asylum first enters into is a country by treaty that is supposed to accept that person. Is that right?
By treaty, well, not necessarily the first country. You can still be in, for example.
No, but it is
No,
okay.
you can stop in another country before you come to the country that requires you to take them. for
I don't
asylum.
want to get too deep into immigration law, but before we end this segment and go to your questions, let me ask a last question. Liz, do you think there are grounds for impeachment of this president? And even if there are, is it too much of political risk for the Democrats to pursue that?
Well, let me say that with regard to the impeachment, that the only presidential impeachment that ever worked, and it never completed itself because it was a resignation, was the one against Richard Nixon in 1974 because it was bipartisan. What triggered that impeachment was not a special prosecutor like Kenneth Starr, was not a Congress foaming at the mouth to get the president, as what happened with Andrew Johnson. The American people said, it's time. And that came about because of the firing of the special prosecutor. The reason I raise that is because the Democrats who controlled the Congress at that time said the very same thing. Impeachment's off the table. We can't do it. We don't want to do it. Period. It's going to divide the country, every argument that is being made today. It didn't divide the country, the process, actually brought the country together because people realized that more important than a party or an individual was the rule of law. And Americans realized that we ourselves agreed on that a majority of Americans agreed on that.
All right.
It was very important.
Let me just interrupt you because it's getting personal here. I went through that. I was sitting in the White
Well,
House.
let me finish what I have to say.
Go ahead.
I want to just, I'm trying not to
And
make
then
it
we wanna hear
personal. I'm
from
trying
Ed.
to talk about it to give you an example of why the arguments that are being made against it now resemble the arguments that were
Liz,
made
I
against.
also want to hear from
But
you briefly of whether there are legal grounds.
I'm just getting to that point.
Okay.
You asked two questions: is it going to happen, basically, and should it happen? What happened then, when it got started, it was nobody even knew what the grounds were for impeachment. And so they had to start a process. They had to learn what the Constitution was, and they had to learn what the facts were. That was a lengthy process, and it worked itself out in a bipartisan way, in essence. You can't have an impeachment that's going to be started by a special prosecutor or by somebody from the outside. It has to start from the American people, but it also has to start with facts. It can't be a gotcha process. You can't say, oh, I want him out of office now. I don't like his policies. I don't like him as a person. I don't agree with what he's doing. You have to meet the constitutional standards. You have to meet the facts. You have to meet the constitutional standards. They have to be facts. And so there need to be investigations of conduct that has not taken place. Unfortunately, the Republicans blocked proper investigations from taking place by the House Intelligence Committee, by the House Judiciary Committee, by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the Senate Intelligence Committee. You need to have full investigations. It doesn't have to be in an impeachment process. Remember, the Senate Watergate Committee uncovered a lot of evidence, including the taping system. So the facts can be brought out in various ways, but we have to be, as a nation, willing to say, okay, facts are there. They don't justify impeachment under the constitutional standard. No impeachment. But if the facts do meet the constitutional standard, then we do have to say, because Congress has a constitutional responsibility to preserve the democracy. So if it does meet the standards, then yes, you have to say there's impeachment. Right now, there's enough evidence to warrant full investigations. I don't think we're ready.
Is there enough evidence to impeach?
Well, the American people have to be persuaded before you can have an impeachment. And we're
pers-
not there.
Are you persuaded?
The American people have persuaded makes it a political matter. It is impeachment is pure politics. It is not a matter of law. And what Johnson could have easily been impeached if his entire history was known at the time, his taping system, what he did in a number. Putting the FBI, bugging Goldwater's campaign.
If Bob Caro had been called as a witness.
Exactly. That's well put. And in fact, I've had those conversations with Bob. And then so it is a political matter. And unfortunately, President Nixon happened to be the only president who came into office in modern times without either one of the houses of his party. And when he made some mistakes, the Washington establishment, including Judge Sirica, who frankly acted unethically in the way he worked with prosecutors, et cetera, which has come out. A lot of things have come out, but it was purely a political process that was, and it is not. It's been divisive because that process carried over. The Republicans were upset about it in the end, and that's why they went after President Clinton. And that gummed up that presidency. And I think it'd be a real mistake, and I think Nancy Pelosi understands that because she really toned it down. It would be a mistake to do that with Donald Trump. I bet if she had a majority or something close to 2/3 in the Senate, she would go ahead and do it.
I think that's perfect timing to turn the program over to a member of the enemies list, Sid Davidoff. And thanks to our panelists, Liz Holtzman and Ed Kant. Good luck with the vote.
I neglected to mention that Sam Roberts has a show every weekend on CUNY TV, a roundup of the week in the Times, and what to expect in the Sunday Times before you get it, so you can jump it. And if you can find Channel 75 or whatever, it's the CUNY TV. Anyway, Sam, thanks. You did a great job. Really appreciate it. Oh, professional. So my job here is to open this to questions. And wait a second. There's some rules here. So to explain how I run it, You should know I'm married to a columnist at the Daily News, Linda Stacy, who has an opinion on everything. And that she gets, and the reason our marriage works is because she gets paid because she has an opinion. I'm a lawyer. Unless you pay me, I don't have an opinion. So I'm going to try to do this the right way. I'm calling on people and expects a little one-sided audience, and so we're going to be gentle here. And we'll start with Ron, since you had your hand up first. And it was the president of Bull and Vittles Club, if that's what it's called. There's a mic here, Ron.
Ed Cox has talked about the impeachment being a political process now. But structurally, that's not true. That's what it has been distorted and evolved to, one can say, given the experience. It's basically an exercise in the rule of law. So I'd like to ask you, in terms of the rule of law, can a president be indicted? Justice Department says no. What do you think? Can you be indicted and convicted of crimes you committed before you were president, regardless of whether they bear on the presidency? Crimes you committed in the process of running for president, because we have the president's Stormy Daniels things. Crimes you committed after you became president. Are there limits to what you can impeach for? And should we be talking first and foremost rather about indicting the president for crimes, see what crimes he's committed, see if we can even convict him in New York State or whatever, and then talk about impeachment?
I'm a corporate and finance lawyer. I'm not an expert in the area you're talking about. I'm sure Liz is. Go ahead, Liz.
Okay, I mean, I can tell you with regard to impeachment, the issue of whether you can be impeached for acts before you become president was discussed during the debates on the impeachment clause, and it was clear from that in the Constitutional Convention that you could be impeached if it for acts taking place before you became president, if they related to your becoming president. So in other words, if you bribed, the example they gave was bribing the electors of the Electoral College. That was a basis for impeachment. Okay, so it's, I think in general, you could argue that from that point, people who obtained their office through some kind of misbehavior, misconduct of that kind, could be impeached. Secondly, I'm skeptical about the opinions of the Office of Legal Counsel. It's not the Justice Department as a whole, it's the Office of Legal Counsel. They basically are there to uphold presidential powers. It's rare that they disagree with an expansion of presidential powers. That's kind of their job. It's not been tested, although the grand jury wanted to indict Richard Nixon, and an indictment was prepared, in fact, but Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, did not submit it because he was concerned about having to delay the prosecution of the other people in the Nixon administration, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and the rest. I don't believe the process is political in the way that Ed Cox has described it. Obviously, it is political in the sense that somehow you're not going to remove, and I think you shouldn't be able to remove a president who's been democratically elected unless there's overwhelming evidence and unless there's popular support for that. Because, and the framers had a big debate about it, whether they should have an impeachment at all. Should we overturn the results of an election? Why not wait till the next election? And that's a very legitimate question. But they all said there's enough danger a president can do to the democracy and the rule of law during the time that he or someday she is in office. We've got to have an impeachment process to take care of that. So it's political in the sense that I think you can't just ram through an impeachment if the American people don't believe that the acts are grave and serious and threaten the democracy. It's not, it shouldn't happen, and I don't believe it ever will happen. I hope it doesn't. So it is political in that sense, but I think it's political in a broader than just a narrow partisan sense. I don't think it should be either. Okay, about prosecution for crimes, I think one of the problems that bothers me